Hey, this is Joe and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I want to talk about the mechanics of God realization experiences. So, psychedelics can produce states of awareness where you feel like you're waking up to your true nature as God. And I'm not speaking metaphorically here. I mean literally, like you wake up and you realize that you're God. But this seems absurd to most people. Obviously, a very small percentage of people have actually had an experience like this, and trying to explain this to someone who hasn't had the experience is very difficult because most people are just going to be resistant to this. But the truth is that this experience is actually consistent with certain Eastern religions that teach similar things, that teach that we're all God, right? And, this experience doesn't teach you that you personally are God. It teaches you really that we're all God. And this is also a difficult distinction to make because, according to some Western religions, this sounds like blasphemy to even think like this, right? It's like, you're not God. You're supposed to only worship the God of this particular religion. So there are some very fine distinctions that are difficult to make here. But I want to start out by just explaining the fundamental mechanics of this experience, because if this experience is real, then you should be able to explain it logically. And the most basic explanation is this. As a human being, you have awareness. You have consciousness, right? And there's some sort of boundary that you draw between you and the rest of the world. So this boundary might be your skin. And you might tend to define yourself as that which is within my skin, and then that which is outside my skin, that's not me. Now, this is just one example of how this boundary might get defined. It might get defined in different ways. But the point is, you're drawing a boundary somewhere, and then you're identifying with things that are internal to that boundary. So what you have to realize is this essentially decision to identify with what's internal is arbitrary. And you could just as easily identify with what's external to you. So, while this would be less conventional, when we think about what a human being is essentially it's what the universe is uniquely doing at a particular set of points in space and time. And what the universe is doing at this point is a product of many complex phenomena that is sort of all intersecting in this point and manifesting itself as a human being. And for you to exist as a human being, many external things had to come together for you to exist like this. You need food and water, and oxygen. These are external things. So you could just as easily as you can put your identity internally, you could also put your identity externally and think, oh, all of these external things are sort of flowing into me, and I am sort of the intersection of all of these external things. And when you think about it, it's like consciousness is not internal to your skin. Consciousness kind of exists on the boundary of the internal and the external. And it's a function of society and social programming that we only identify with what's internal to us. But really, again, consciousness exists on the boundary. And it kind of works either way. And when you realize that this is arbitrary, when you realize that you can direct your identity internally or externally, you realize that why can't you do both simultaneously? Why can't you identify with what's internal and with what's external? And when you do that, you're the whole universe. And if the whole universe is conscious, then you're the whole universe and you're conscious and you're God. So this is actually not that complicated. Now, it does give rise to some paradoxes, which is like, okay, if I'm God and you're also God, how exactly does that work? So there are some very interesting questions that arise, but the fundamental mechanics are that choosing to direct your identity internally is arbitrary. So I've had some other realizations recently. I had a profound realization, and I'm not necessarily saying this is correct, but I was thinking about free will and determinism, and I was thinking about, the age-old philosophical question of, does free will exist? And this is obviously, a very polarizing issue. You have people like Sam Harris saying that, free will is not even a logically coherent idea. So a lot of scientifically minded people think we don't have free will. But then the idea of not having free will is kind of offensive in certain ways because, our whole identity rests on having a sense of agency, and we want to feel free. We want to feel like we can make choices in life. And saying that we don't have free will seems to take this agency away from us. But the realization that I had was that, okay, maybe to actually solve this free will problem, we have to really think outside the box, because the thing about conventional thinking is it doesn't do a very good job of explaining reality itself. Because conventional thinking tells us that, why does something exist as opposed to nothing? Conventional thinking can't answer that fundamental question. So by conventional thinking, nothing would exist at all. So obviously conventional thinking is not very good at providing answers to these deep philosophical questions. So conventional thinking tells us that, either we have free will or we don't, and, maybe the scientists are right, or maybe the religious people are right, and, we'll see who wins this debate. But the realization that I had was that what if the question, does free will exist, is sort of like a joke that God is telling, that it's just a paradox, and that there is no answer because it's a paradox. And it's a paradox because reality is paradoxical. And that if you think about it, the assumption that one side of the free will argument is correct is just that, it's an assumption, right? It's sort of an axiom. And the thing is, you can't prove axioms. Every belief system has the axioms of that belief system, the fundamental assumptions, and fundamental assumptions can't be proven. So what if the fundamental assumption of the question is incorrect? And what if we have free will and we don't? And that's just the way it is. That reality itself is paradoxical. And that the question is structured in such a way that either option leads to absurdity. So there's a paradox in set theory, which I've read a little bit about, like, sort of the history of this. I don't remember, like, all the people involved, but essentially what it is was that mathematicians used to think that you could define set theory in such a way that would essentially be logically coherent. That you could have a set theory which would sort of be all-encompassing, but then there was a mathematician who came up with an exception to this, which the exception, the paradox, is basically consider the set of all sets that don't contain themselves, right? So a set is a member of this set if and only if it doesn't contain itself. Well, then the question becomes, does this set contain itself? And the thing is, if it doesn't, then it does. And if it does, then it doesn't. It's a paradox. Even though the definition of this set seems logically coherent, like this is a logically coherent way to define a set, there are sets which it's not clearly defined whether it's in the set or not. And that, this is paradox seems to be actually built into the structure of reality. And of course, other people have spoken about this idea of paradox being fundamental to reality. This isn't my idea, but what if the free will paradox is one of those fundamental paradoxes? And I also wanted to talk about how I think, psychedelic God realization is a really interesting metaphor for the trials and tribulations of life. And that's because, so there's one thing you have to understand about God realization, which is that it's terrifying. So it might sound like it's a good thing. Oh, you're waking up as God, and I guess maybe that sounds good. But really, it's terrifying because what you're realizing is that you are everything. You're not just the good stuff. You're all the bad stuff, too. And the thing is, as humans, we have a strong desire we're constantly being selective about how we want to identify and how we want to think of ourselves. And we want to be good and not bad. We want to be moral and not immoral. We want to be, skinny and not fat. We want to be, in a happy relationship and not single and alone. And we're constantly trying to just be selective. And the thing about God realization is it's not selective. Like, all selections break down. And you are everything. You're all the worst things. And even explaining that to you it's not quite like that, because it's not in human terms, but it's just like, it's like reality is this infinite fractal pattern, and you're the whole thing. You're not just the soft, cuddly parts. You're all the sharp edges. And it's utterly terrifying, But I think this is a really good metaphor for life because, while life may not quite be that extreme, there are things in life that we just don't want to deal with, and we wish we didn't have to deal with. But what's useful for me is thinking about those as, okay, these are kind of like the parts of the God experience that terrify me. That life is suffering because I can't just embrace the whole thing. Like, life is suffering precisely because of the human drive to be selective about our identity. And that the solution is to embrace the whole thing. And that if you embrace the whole thing, then it's kind of like you suffer up front, but eventually you kind of acclimate to that, and it just kind of is what it is. And while, the God realization is terrifying, it ultimately is okay. Like, it's ultimately fine. And it's ultimately the way it is anyway. So it's like learning to accept the suffering of this awakening experience. By learning how to deal with the experience of awakening, you can apply those same techniques to just the trials and tribulations of everyday life. So I hope this video was useful to someone. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you in the next video.